is what we're seeing with the increased artillery fire in the past, few days, a sort of a Russian attempt to make the Ukrainians slow down in Kursk or withdraw? Is it just a case of indiscriminate attacks is what the Kremlin resorts to?
Well, first of all, escalate to de-escalate when you're talking about nuclear weapons is a highly loaded emotive term, particularly for people who've been watching this over the years, because there was a fad for saying that this was Russia's approach, a thing of the past in terms of that specific construct for how Russia would end conflicts, and it is a great deal more broad and nuanced in terms of how Russia has thought about war termination. But in terms of the escalation overall, yes, Russia does have other options. And we see, for instance, the knee-jerk reaction that happens every time something embarrasses or upsets Moscow, which is to lash out and kill as many civilian casualties in Ukraine as possible through the air and missile bombardment.
This is The Global Gambit.
Right, well, Russia's continuing to make gains towards Pokrovsk, and generally the situation, the energy that was around Ukraine in its initial incursion or offensive, depending upon who you ask, as our conversation with Ben Hodges revealed, it's slowing down, and attention is returning towards more of the line of contact and existing eastern flank with, the Kremlin is making gains. There is no other way to say it, unfortunately. Just as at the time of recording, the Russians are making gains, or what they claim to be sort of initial gains, of smaller towns that include Harlivka, around 30 kilometers from Pokrovsk, and Petrivstivka. I know I didn't say that right, despite having Russian heritage. That is quite awkward. But that being said, there's a lot here to unpack, and things are moving quickly, and we need an expert, and I have one. Well, I think I do. And he is Keir. He is not Keir Starmer. He is Keir Giles, who is who to quote himself just before we started, writes on Russian stuff. But I don't think that's a good enough introduction. He is a senior consulting fellow for the Russia program at Chatham House, one of the most distinguished institutions of its kind in the world, and certainly in the UK. And I'm delighted that he's been willing to join the show, given the dynamism around the situation, and certainly trying to make sense of something that I don't really fully think I could. But Keir, it's lovely to have you on the program. How are you at the moment?
Yeah, struggling on, thank you. Busy like everybody else that's watching Russia at the moment.
Yes, indeed. It's also crappy English weather, as we're both sort of experiencing here, so we can have a very British conversation about it, perhaps. But quips aside, this is a show that looks at the West's place in the world and geopolitical risk and its relationship to the market. So if that's of interest to you, then consider subscribing if you find the conversation of value. But Keir, I think the first thing I wanted to really get your assessment of is, as I say, Russia is making gains. There's not really any way to sugarcoat that. And I think if we continue to say that Ukraine isn't facing some headwinds in that regard, it's a disservice to the situation. What do you make of it at the moment from the Ukrainian perspective? And then maybe we can dive deeper into what the Russians are aiming to achieve there.
Well, I think the first point is you're absolutely right that Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast has dropped out of the headlines a bit, but I don't think we should necessarily see that as a bad thing. What it means is that it's become normalized, that Russia, for whatever reason, has not succeeded in actually dealing with this. There is not this counteroffensive that's been expected more or less from day one of this incursion, and it is an accepted fact that's fading into the background now, with all of the attention focused now on other parts of that immensely long front line. And yes, it's true that Russia is continuing to make gains territorially around the Pokrovsk area, but also it seems to be passive along large sectors of other areas of the front where previously it had also been pushing forward. So that's an indication that while Ukraine is suffering these losses around that one specific Russian salient, where Russia is continuing to push forward at immense cost in casualties, and Ukraine is effectively trading land for the amount of damage that it can inflict on the Russian armed forces, some of those other objectives of moving into Kursk region have in fact been achieved. In fact, we had President Zelensky saying just as much just yesterday. And that includes, of course, the seizure, the capture of large numbers of Russian prisoners in order to exchange for people who've been held in Russian captivity, Ukrainians subjected to systematic torture for months and years, which, of course, is a significant issue in Ukrainian domestic politics. That in itself, even if it's a secondary objective of moving into Kursk, is quite a significant one. And, of course, you have had the withdrawal of certain numbers of Russian troops from areas of the front line to try to deal with the situation there, to try to stabilize it. Perhaps not as many as people initially hoped. So there were these expectations that Russia's offensives would cease completely, but definitely a noticeable trend nonetheless. Now, one expectation that was there for this incursion into Kursk, which has been belied, is that it would demonstrate once and for all that all of the fears about Russia's red lines and potential Russian escalation were misplaced. Now, of course, it's shown that all of those people that were saying the fighting cannot spread to Russian territory, that will lead to escalation in the form of Russian nuclear use, were as misguided as all of the other prophets of doom about Russian escalation, who've been so imbued, so inculcated in this Russian nuclear propaganda over the past decade. But sadly, it doesn't actually matter, because none of the evidence, none of the proof that this fear of escalation is not something that should drive US policy has actually made the slightest dent in that policy. There is a fixed course that we're seeing from Washington that will not permit Russia to be inconvenienced or excessively embarrassed by Western weapons being supplied to Ukraine, and that does not appear to be shifting. So the gains that Ukraine has made from this is secondary, but there's still this conversation ongoing about, is an audacious gamble, it's a risk, is it actually paying off? On balance, it appears the answer at the moment is yes. Because particularly we see these continuing advances around Pokrovsk, and we hear the same language about that area as we heard previously about other centers of the fighting, like Bakhmut, like Avdiivka, all of them described in the same terms in terms of the amount of damage it does to Ukraine's fortunes if they actually fall to Russia. So we shouldn't necessarily expect that there's going to be a catastrophic outcome immediately if Ukraine does fall back sufficiently far that Pokrovsk falls to Russia.
All right, so a lot there. And before I go towards more of the unpacking of the details a little bit more around that front, just why do you think that is then, regarding the continued unwillingness of the US to shift its policy, the Biden administration unwilling to shift its policy about the use of particularly long-range weapons within Russia, or to use your words, inconvenience it, right? Why, despite this, we've seen this rather uncharacteristic divergence of opinion between Whitehall in the UK, right, and DC in Washington in the use of storm shadows, right? Obviously, they're British missiles, and I think the UK has ultimate say, but equally, the US is the head of NATO, and so there's this sort of slight complex loggerhead situation. So, yeah, what's your assessment there?
Well, on Storm Shadow specifically, let's not forget that the reporting around that has been confusing. It has been contradictory, including from British government sources. So it's really quite hard to get to the bottom of what the situation is there. But the balance of evidence seems to suggest that, as you implied, the UK would be perfectly happy for Storm Shadow to be used as intended and strike deep into Russia. But they have been in some way blocked or prevented or persuaded not to by the United States. And that, of course, is a part of this blanket ban that the US has tried to put on strikes into Russia by any means they possibly can. As for the why, of course, that's been an ongoing conversation for the last 2+ years, not only the strikes into Russia, but also the hesitancy over supplying Ukraine with whatever package of weapon systems it identifies as being essential at any given moment. And there's been vast quantities of ink expended on trying to speculate as to what exactly it is that is constraining the Biden White House. And so much so that, in fact, in the middle of last year, in 2023, I and a group of other folks from Chatham House, the Russia watchers there, traveled to Washington, D.C. We were trying to hawk a report that we'd written called How to End the War on Ukraine, which should have been called How Not to End the War on Ukraine. It was looking at all of the different scenarios for the conflict coming to an end that would, in fact, be disastrous, but were very popular at the time. And we did the rounds in Washington, D.C., went to State Department, National Security Council, Pentagon, etc., trying to dig into the reasons for this hesitancy and this timorousness. Now, partly, we got a lot of different explanations from different places, which might explain some of the policy incoherence. There were some people we talked to who were very firm on the idea that Russia was on a nuclear hair trigger, and so anything that you did that could precipitate Russia feeling that its military was under threat of collapse would precipitate this nuclear exchange. You had other people who said, absolutely not, that's not the case, that's not driving our policy, it's all technical, logistical, it's all technical delays rather than political ones. But when we pushed back against all of the arguments and went through all of the instances through which the red lines have been proven to be imaginary and the delays have proven to be self-defeating, what people consistently fell back on was, well, this is the policy of our president, and therefore that's what we've got to do. So it does seem as though those people that suggest that President Biden and those closest to him giving him advice have actually been susceptible to this long-term campaign of Russian reflexive control are actually onto something, because the construct, the mold view within which these decisions are being taken seems to be such that you cannot defeat Russia because it is too risky and too dangerous to do so. Therefore, you have to not allow a situation where Russia is defeated, even in a war that it started.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's a good, I think, segue. I still want to unpack a little bit more, but I mean, just on that point, I personally think that the Biden administration has been quite, whilst they've been quite successful, I think, in the sphere with China and strategic competition. There was a good piece in the Financial Times about sort of the secret strategic meetings between Sullivan and Wang Yi and others in the past year and a half. I think Israel, the Middle East, and Ukraine have certainly not been the most effective policy. And but this brings me in a little bit then. What other options do the Russians actually have, other than the idea of a nuclear response or escalation? Escalate to de-escalate is the typical sort of approach. What other options do they have? Because as far as I can see, there's not many. They're not going to use a tactical nuke within their own territory, but equally striking somewhere across Ukraine with such a weapon is not going to happen. Is what we're seeing with the increased artillery fire in the past few days a sort of a Russian attempt to make the Ukrainians slow down in Kursk or withdraw? Is it just a case of indiscriminate attacks? Is what the Kremlin resorts to?
Well, first of all, escalate to de-escalate when you're talking about nuclear weapons is a highly loaded emotive term, particularly for people who've been watching this over the years, because there was a fad for saying that this was Russia's approach based on some fairly old doctrinal documents that's now considered largely a thing of the past in terms of that specific construct for how Russia would end conflicts. And it is a great deal more broad and nuanced in terms of how Russia has thought about war termination. But in terms of the escalation overall, yes, Russia does have other options. And we see, for instance, the knee-jerk reaction that happens every time something embarrasses or upsets Moscow, which is to lash out and kill as many civilian casualties in Ukraine as possible through the air and missile bombardments. That follows Russian strategic reverses absolutely reliably every single time.
Right.
More broadly, of course, you've got this campaign of sabotage and reconnaissance for attacks across Europe as a whole, and the resurrection of all of the murder plots that we saw in the previous decade, which seems to be increasing in tempo and intensity since the beginning of this year. At least what's surfacing in the public domain is the number of reported attacks, reported plots, prosecutions, investigations going on is increasing all the time right across Europe. So that is one other means by which Russia could target the West and appears already to be doing so, but it's not necessarily wise to think of that as an escalation or a response, because as so often, it's something that Russia wants to do anyway and will do as soon as it feels capable of doing so, regardless of what else is going on.
I see. So when it comes again then to the eastern flank, what we've seen is the Russians sort of being quite conventional in the way that they conduct themselves, but people seem to not fully understand, I think, the mentality that Russians approach conflict or war more broadly. Soviet doctrine is sort of what I largely see happening. Is that still applicable, or has the Russian, obviously it's evolved as the war has continued from the first couple of years, where we saw those literal booklets, pictures of those booklets from like the 1940s or early 50s, right? Sort of being used as the way to sort of suggest that's how they conduct operations in certain areas. What are we seeing now? Have they evolved their tactical and operational approach towards them that they're within Ukraine?
Well, that's right. There's been this combination of this incredibly rapid technological evolution and the phases of how Russia has been approaching seizing territory from Ukraine that we've seen developing over the course of this war underpinned by some things that simply don't change and are recognizable from decades or centuries of Russian and Soviet approaches to warfighting. And of course, the biggest difference being the value that is actually attached to the lives of your servicemen, where Russia is still, not to the extent that we saw over previous months, but still to some extent willing to use Russian bodies to soak up Ukrainian bullets, because the value of each of those in the Russian conception is totally different to what we take for granted in a Western military. So Russia is behaving as though it has a bottomless sump of manpower, and it can simply use these human wave attacks indefinitely, despite the fact that what this Kursk incursion by Ukraine has shown is that, no, they don't have sufficient people to line the border, or even sufficient reserves to mount a prompt counterattack to something which you might have thought they would see as a direct threat. So the underlying approach that Russia shows seems not to have changed. And in some ways, they've abandoned some of their attempts to being a more mobile, a more proficient military after that military was eviscerated in the early stages of the fighting. And they've gone back to their comfort zone of simply throwing people at the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In the early days, you had this rather remarkable attempt at the the initial invasion itself, I guess you could say, on February 24th, where they really sort of came in multiple prongs, and there was this is what the Russian second most powerful military is truly capable of. But it quickly became apparent that it wasn't a military led entity; it was the FSB security services, and the whole thing was quickly undermined. And then they just fell back into old ways. But again, just bringing in sort of comparisons to Kursk a little bit, from my understanding, that is predominantly being dealt with, well, quote unquote, dealt with by conscripts or volunteers of the Russian military versus the seasoned, again, quote unquote, seasoned soldiers on the east. Is that sort of the general sort of setup of things? And when we're talking about seasoned military staff of the Russians, what does that actually mean nowadays? Because they've obviously seen a lot of fatalities of some of their best soldiers, Spetsnaz. I'm not entirely sure where they are or what they're doing. If you could break down that a little bit more, that would be really good.
Yes, it does seem that the Kursk incursion encountered conscripts to start with. What's happened after that is a little bit hazy and a little bit hard to understand what's going on, because the expected moving up of Russian reserves and transferring of experienced troops from other parts of the front to crush this incursion simply hasn't happened. And instead, you've got Ukraine apparently afforded the luxury of consolidating its positions while waiting for Russia to actually do something. So the fact that they encountered conscripts was more or less an accident. It's simply that the military presence there, which was not expected to do the fighting, was made up of these inexperienced troops. And it's also the case that, as you suggested, a lot of the most experienced, the most proficient parts of the Russian military have already been wiped out. So what you have is a larger force. Let's not forget this is already a much bigger army than the one that actually started the war, but which is at a much lower level of skill, proficiency, training, equipment too, with the exception of the innovations, the technological innovations that have augmented Russia's capabilities. So it's a different force from the one that started. But it wasn't necessarily a bad plan that Russia went in with. It was a perfectly sensible plan for dealing with the situation that Russia thought it had in February 2022. It's just that plan was based on completely, wildly misguided appreciation of the situation in Ukraine. If they'd got their basic facts right, it would have worked.
Yes, no, there's a very good piece by the Imperial War Museum about, this whole idea that they just sort of assumed the Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms, and that all they had to do was secure sort of specific strategic posts, and then the military would come in and help with the overall administration of the new territories that were caught or liberated in their view. But it quickly became apparent that that's not the case, and it was sort of this very skeleton force that was leading the charge, and it was non-existent. But I would like to also ask you a little bit more the comparisons of what we're seeing. You touched upon it a little bit, but since Ukraine has had its retraining or evolution of the military, what we've seen them doing in Kursk with the establishment of these corridors, the sort of not utilizing total war and sort of blanketing, civilian sites and sort of allowing civilians to move freely around, out, or whatever it is. how's that compared to what the Russians have been doing? How much has the Ukrainian, I'll rephrase it, how much has the Ukrainian military evolved with the sort of, training from NATO and Western styled approaches to warfare?
I don't think it's necessarily the case that that has been the result of NATO training and a Western style of warfare. It's simply a non-Russian style of warfare. If you observe international humanitarian law, you treat civilians as civilians, you basically behave with a certain amount of underlying basic humanity. That is what sets you apart from how Russia approaches conflict and always has done. And one of the most depressing aspects of the early stages of the war was seeing Russia and Russian troops and Russian individuals, ordinary Russians in uniform, behaving exactly as they had done over previous decades and centuries in previous conflicts, much to everybody's surprise. Over the years, I've given plenty of lectures to places like NATO Defence College, Staff College here in the UK. One of the things that came sadly true when talking about what the nature of the next conflict with Russia would be was that we shouldn't expect Russians to behave any differently towards their enemies, towards the civilian population, towards each other than they had done in places like Chechnya, Syria, the Second World War, any conflict you care to name, because that basic brutality and savagery and complete disregard for any humanitarian norms is just a defining factor of the Russian way of war.
All right, so I want to bring in a little bit more about the sort of the political dynamics here. Obviously, you've touched upon the sort of the decision making, and what I find quite curious is obviously we've had a restructuring of Putin's military command structure, the defense ministry, and it's being led by a finance guy, right? Belousov is not exactly someone we would imagine being the best placed to deal with a offensive or the situation with Kursk, nor sort of the momentum the Russians seem to have at the moment in the east. What's your assessment there in how this sort of shake-up, to call it that, is having on the sort of political military relationship, or it doesn't matter too much since Gerasimov is, overall the chief commanding, chief commander of the military forces?
Well, how much it matters is impossible to tell, and what's actually really going on deep down is impossible to tell. There are some very smart people who've looked very closely at the trajectories of all of the individuals involved in this that have come up with theories about precisely why Belousov is in, and Shoigu's people are being apparently picked off one by one. But, of course, you never know for sure. It's still the same situation you've always had with Russia, that the infighting is bulldogs fighting under a rug, and you never know who's going to come out on top until the growling stops and the bones come out. So we can speculate all we like, but it's the practical effect of this that we need to see. And one of the early interpretations for why Belousov was put in, an accountant, as you say, was simply to try to make the war fighting more efficient and therefore more affordable because of the enormous amount of Russia's state economy that is actually going into prosecuting the war at the moment. There's always been a recognition, there's more recently been a recognition within Russia that you can't spend your entire budget on the military, because then you spend yourself into state collapse in exactly the same way that Russia has done repeatedly over the centuries, and 2.5 times in the 20th century alone. Putin's been very explicit about saying, we know that's a mistake, we're not going to do it again. But of course, that's a trajectory that Russia would eventually have been on. Now, again, you trust the economists who look at this and say, well, Russia can actually sustain what's going on for as long as oil prices are sufficiently high and they still find buyers, even at a discount for the energy that they're exporting, plus their enormous financial reserves that they had at the beginning of the war. But that's a fragile situation. And the long-term damage to the Russian economy by turning it into a war economy, of course, is going to be huge. That in itself is just a reflection of Russia's priorities, where you prioritize the military and the war over the long-term future of the country. But it eventually is going to hit Russia and hit it hard. And of course, that looking for ways of mitigating that effect is going to be one of the factors that's playing on the minds of those Russian senior figures that actually care about the long-term future of the country.
Indeed. And I mean, just bringing in also a little bit, from what obviously these numbers are all up in the air, but most, I think, reasonable assessments, or sort of if you go, maximum scenario, lowest scenario, middle, sort of take the middle one, You've got at least 80,000 fatalities on both sides, more or less, at this point. Casualty numbers, it's through the hundreds of thousands, obviously. Point I'm getting at, though, is that there might need to be another push for mobilization, but that is obviously highly provocative and potentially destabilizing for Putin's position. I don't think his position is exactly untenable, and I don't think Kursk has remotely bothered the Kremlin in the sense that they genuinely feel a threat. But what options do you think the Kremlin has to try and bolster its military standing? Because other than this nuclear threat, which, well, I've just checked Al Jazeera, and they said that the Kremlin is quote unquote adjusting its nuclear doctrine because the US is quote provoking tension. So typical sort of rhetoric coming out there. But what other options does Putin have at home to sort of increase his lines other than mobilization? It looks quite sort of limited, though.
Well, if you're looking to Al Jazeera for coverage of Russia adjusting its nuclear doctrine, do check out the explainer that they've put out about what it all means, because it quotes at length a certain Keir Giles who has certain opinions on this. About
right, I'll have to look him up. Do you know him? Is he?
It's actually part of the show that we've seen over and over again over the years, and it's actually part of this campaign of trying to constrain the United States, and doing so very successfully because people react to this stuff with great excitement. But in terms of Russia sustaining the military effort, stealth mobilization appears for the time being to have been working perfectly well for them, dredging this manpower sump of the ethnic minorities, of foreigners, although how much use exactly they're going to be on the front line is an open question as always. Convicts who are continuing to sign up, people who civil society, in such as it is, in the big cities won't actually notice. But that too, of course, is going to be a finite resource. And really the question is not so much the political impact of an overt mobilization drive that does affect those people that have a political weight and a political sway, but whether the mechanism of repression is actually going to be sufficient to contain the damage from that. And there Russia does have an enormous reserve of repressive capacity for making sure that any public dissent is not, in fact, going to cause a serious problem. And that's something that has been being built up in parallel with the preparations for war, and like the preparations for war, accelerated sharply in the second half of 2021. This was a period when Russia moved from managing domestic dissent to trying to wipe it out altogether. Instead of harassing the opposition, they started locking them up. Instead of controlling demonstrations, they started throwing everybody into jail to depress that instinct and that will to actually come out on the streets. And that, of course, has been accelerating at the same time as the war has gone on. So it's no longer the case that Putin would be so much at risk from that overt and undeniable mobilization program as he would have been, say, even just a couple of years ago.
Curious. All right, that's interesting. I mean, we talk about, I think, Putin doing these mini purges, as I've heard some people reference them. It's not obviously the purges of the 1930s in Stalin, but he does these occasional things where he removes certain people at more lower level, perhaps. I mean, Shoigu's one of his closest just friends as much as professional allies, so I don't see him making such a sort of significant shock in that regard.